Okay, away we go. Hello everyone, welcome to Phoenixville Library, those of you here in person and on Zoom, to the next program in our Community Gardening Around the Village series, tonight focusing on native plants, what they are, how to use them, and we are pleased to have with us tonight Casey Schmidt from Colonial Gardens. In fact, her family owns Colonial Gardens, so it's really a pleasure to have her here tonight. Those of you on Zoom and wanting to interact, please type any questions, comments into the chat, and I will relay them to Casey during the presentation. Otherwise, Casey, take it away.
Hi, everybody. How's it going?
Hi.
I was just saying to our in-class people that we're going to try and pick up the energy with how gloomy it's been. We've been working at a garden center. Like, when it's like this after a while, it just feels like Groundhog's Day, just over and over and over again. So, ready to talk about some native plants. Hopefully that gets you hyped like it gets me hyped. So, thanks so much for joining us. And thank you, Mark, for contacting me about this. I'm excited to do this presentation. I've done this presentation probably about 4 times for East Pikeland Township. I have done versions that we've gotten done in 45 minutes, and I've done versions where it's been an hour and a half. I'm aiming for that 45 minutes with lots of time for questions. So over the course of this presentation, I'll be asking you guys some questions just to see where you guys are at. And feel free to ask if something's not clear when I am explaining it. But if you have any kind of in-depth questions or gardening questions, if you'll just save them to the end, just so we can see if we cover them later in the presentation and give everybody a chance to kind of digest what's going on. So, I'm still learning how to use this. Aha, okay. So a little bit about me. I was born in Phoenixville Hospital. My dad was born in Phoenixville Hospital. My daughter was born in Phoenixville Hospital. It's family tradition. And I was basically born in Colonial Gardens. My family has owned it since 1967. My grandfather started it, and now my dad is the owner and has been for the last 20 years or so. I worked there from the age of 6 years old up basically my entire life since then. For 6 years, I was a conservation educator, so I actually moved out to Indianapolis. I worked at the Indianapolis Zoo, talking to people about wild animals, how they can act in their daily lives to make their lives more sustainable and protect wild species around the world. So after that part of my career journey was over, I was excited to be able to rejoin our family business, partially because we had really started moving a lot towards native plants, and I saw this opportunity. Instead of just talking to people about native plants, I could actively put one in their hand and send it home with them and tell them how they can best use it in their yard. So this is definitely conservation action. If you're feeling like you want to be empowered to help save endangered species, you might have some in your backyard, and this is a really good way to help out with that. My title now is Engagement Manager at Colonial. That is just a really broad title. I do the social media, I help with all the event planning, I run the plant care team, and native plants falls under my purview. So my dad and I both do a lot of the ordering. We now carry about 100 species of native plants. So how many of you guys have been to Colonial before? Okay, basically everyone, hi. If you haven't, why not? Come visit us. We're up on 724, just on the edge of Phoenixville, towards the Spring City side. We're one of the largest garden centers in the area, partially just by everybody else disappearing over time, but also through a lot of hard work of trying to make sure that we can offer a really wide selection to our customers. And again, that involves over 100 species of native plants. And that's when I counted in like February with our plan, and we have been able to get even more in. So that's over the course of the year. It kind of constantly changes, but it's an exciting array that we're able to offer. We also do landscape design and installation, so if you are interested in getting plants in your yard but you don't want to do it yourself and you want someone professional to lay it out for you, we do that as well. We also have a florist, and we do lots of seasonal events, so maybe if you haven't been there for the garden center, you've been there for our hayride or Christmas light show or all of that sort of stuff. And if you haven't, again, you should come out, it's fun. Nope, that's the other way. There we go. I will get good at this eventually. So let's start out with what is a native plant. And actually, we'll start here. A plant is considered native if it occurs naturally in an area without human introduction. So that's already a little bit of a squishy definition, because humans have been interacting with plants since we've been humans, probably even earlier. And so around here we normally put that time period around European colonization, anything that occurred here before then. But we should be clear that indigenous people around our area were interacting with plants, they were cultivating plants, they were planting and spreading plants over time. But when Europeans came over, that's when we really introduced a bunch of new species that would have been really difficult for them to naturally come into this space. So typically when we're talking about native plants to our area, we are talking about ones that occurred here prior to European colonization, and that's about 2,100 native plants just here in PA. So let's do a little pop quiz. Anyone know what that is? Yeah, echinacea, yep. So that is probably Echinacea pallida, which is pale purple coneflower, but there's also purpurea, which is another native species as well. What about this guy? That's the hard one. That's viburnum out there, so we've got lots of viburnum. What about this one? Goldenrod, yeah. So goldenrod's a nice fall bloomer around here too. So lots of native species, perennials, shrubs, trees, and they all have their own role. So if we have native plants, we also have non-native plants. So non-native plants that are not invasive tend to come from warmer climates and do not readily reproduce under our current conditions. So when we talk about native plants, and then we take their opposites, the non-natives, it's not a value judgment necessarily. Some people will see native plant and they will see it as good, and non-native plant is bad. But just strictly by scientific definition, they're just a descriptor of where that plant came from and how it got into that area. So they have unique benefits and disadvantages depending on the particular plant, but those are just kind of the two broad categories of plant. When you dive a little bit deeper into non-native plants, there are ones that we would consider negative. What are we calling those? Anyone know? Invasive species. That's right, yeah. So the funny thing about that scientific definition is basically any plant that causes ecological, economic, or social harm. So like that's actually has in its scientific definition, this is a bad plant, or this is a bad animal, because animals can be invasive species too. It is a non-native plant that comes into an area and causes some sort of harm. Now you might also say like social harm, economic harm, maybe that's not how we all conceive of invasive species, but if you think of something like a bug that comes over and starts destroying our crops, that would be not just a non-native species, but an invasive species. Or if it is something that caused some sort of illness, or it started being like kudzu and swallowing our buildings, that would be something that would be considered an invasive plant. So kind of going back to the non-native plants, anyone know what this is?
Lantana.
Lantana, yeah. I love lantana. It's deer resistant and it is attractive to hummingbirds and butterflies. So a lot of people love putting it in their annual gardens. Around here, it is from the tropics, so it does not survive our winters. So while it is non-native, it is not an invasive species here because our winters kill it off, and if you like planting it in your garden, you're gonna have to buy it again next year or save the seeds. But if you live in Florida, that is an invasive species because this particular one is from South America. So it will generally, when you become invasive, you outcompete native plants for their space, and that's how you would cause ecological harm because that impacts the whole food web, which we'll get into in a moment. So I mentioned what this is earlier. Does anyone know what that is? Kudzu, yeah, the plant that ate the South. Yeah. So believe it or not, purposely introduced to help stop erosion. That's what it was originally thought to do. I actually did a project on kudzu when I was in college and just kind of did some analysis of papers that exist of how do you get rid of it, and you can literally light it on fire and it will still come back. It's one of those plants where if you kill it down to the root, if the root base still exists, it can still come up. You can bury it. It is extremely difficult to get rid of. And that's one thing we should always note about invasive species. It is much easier to prevent an invasive species than it is to try and roll it back, because typically they're outcompeting other species for a reason. They have some sort of really good survival strategy that's helping them be the best competitor out there. Does anyone know what this one is? Barberry, yeah. This is a Japanese barberry. So this was one in the horticultural industry that was really, really popular as a landscaping shrub because deer don't eat it. And if you garden around here, you know that deer are a big challenge for us. And the deer, oftentimes, there's more non-native species that would fit into deer resistant than there are native species, although there are native species that are deer resistant. Japanese barberries do spread. I have very negative connotations with them because I would plant them at the mini golf course on the left-handed side of the course, so you'd back up into them, and they're very thorny. That's why the deer don't like them. But they also can be picked up by their berries, by birds, spread out into the forest, the birds poop out the seeds, and then you've got barberries coming out of nowhere. Now, the deer don't want to eat them because they're nice and spiny, and lots of other animals that might rely on the nearby foliage for food or for shelter don't necessarily recognize the barberry in the same way or can't use them in the same way. So you will still see barberries at garden centers, but in Pennsylvania, that's because they can only sell legally sterilized barberries. So if you were someone who had your heart set on a barberry, there are varieties that are available. They had to go through extensive testing to make sure that they don't spread their seeds anywhere, so they don't actually berry. There are some other species that are like that too. Does anyone know what else has been banned in PA?
Pear.
The pear, yeah. So if you've heard of the Bradford or the Callery pear, they've kind of taken down that field now, but across from where Staples used to be, if you look in the springtime, it'll be a bunch of white flowers, and that is all pear trees that came off of existing landscaping trees. And pear trees were used for a long time because they had beautiful white flowers, they were very vase-shaped, so they're a very attractive shape, but they grew out of control. The seeds spread really quickly. They also ended up, on the long term, not being very good landscaping trees because windstorms break them very easily. I don't particularly care for the smell of a Bradford pear if you've been near one. It's not a normal floral scent. It smells a little bit more like cat pee. And so they have been illegal in Pennsylvania. So there are certain species of plants that have been deemed so invasive or a noxious weed at this point that they are no longer available for sale. We've had a lady once say, "Hey, I can get one from New Jersey and bring it in. Will you plant it?" And we're like, no, you don't want that. And as of this point, there's no pears, and these are ornamental pears. You can still plant edible pears, but these ornamental pears from the Callery pear line, they don't have any that are certified as sterile, so there are no options for that. And that's okay, because we're going to teach you all about native plants that you want to plant instead. So we're going to go into why native plants. So I want to ask you guys why you're interested in native plants. And anyone on the Zoom chat, if you guys have a reason that you're interested, go ahead and shout it out. Yes?
Sound like they good for the environment for all the other insects and creatures.
All the creatures. I like that, all the creatures. Some people are like, just butterflies, that's all I'm interested in, but all the creatures are really how it benefits. Butterflies too, though. There's a really good impact for a lot of our native wildlife. Any other reasons you might be interested? You don't have to mow as much. That's speaking my language. Replacing lawns is a really great way to spread your native plants around your yard a little bit. And that comes from another sentiment. A lot of people see native plants as very low maintenance, which can be true. We'll talk a little bit about the nuances there. But having a low maintenance option, something that's adapted to your climate, is an attractive option. Do we have anything from the Zoom? No? Yeah. That's all right. We've covered kind of the big ones, and we'll talk a little bit about them. So number one, I swear this had a title, is wildlife. So there's a lot of different ways that native plants impact wildlife. So the reason that they are uniquely useful to our wildlife is because they have this co-evolutionary tract. So imagine them for millions of years as plants and animals both change. They're almost like puzzle pieces for each other as they move along. The insects learn to recognize the visual and the chemical signals that these plants have to be able to recognize them as food. And the plants in turn will change their flowers over time to allow specific species or genuses of bees or butterflies to be able to pollinate them most efficiently. So let's talk about pollination first, because that's a really important one. Basically, whenever you have an animal visit a flower, they have a chance to pick up pollen. Now, the bee is typically going after nectar and pollen, which they use as protein. Butterflies are typically going after nectar, which is a very sweet liquid that the plants produce specifically for bugs. Nectar does not really have a use to the plant itself other than attracting pollinators to it. So when the bee comes up, they're going to get their nectar, they're going to maybe get a little bit of pollen on purpose or a lot by accident. It's going to rub up against their legs and collect on their bodies so that when they go to the next flower, they're able to cross-pollinate. So that pollen comes in contact with reproductive parts of the other plant, and that's how you get genetic diversity within plant populations. So plants want pollinators. So you might have, for example, there's a native plant called Jacob's ladder that has a very specific genus of native bees that it has co-evolved with. So those native bees are active in the early spring when that flower comes up, and they are small enough bodied to be able to fit in that specific flower. And so we know that they are specific to that genus. That is what they prefer to pollinate. So this is really important for both the plants and the insects. When you introduce non-native plants into the area, nectar is kind of nectar. As far as I can tell, there's not some significant research saying that nectar significantly varies, but it is about the bug being able to recognize the plant as food, both as an adult, and then making sure that you have food as a larva as well. And that kind of brings us to our monarch butterfly. So does anyone know what plant monarch butterflies need?
Milkweed.
Milkweed, yeah. So this is where we get a little bit even more specific. We have about 400 species of native bees in Pennsylvania and about 100 species of butterflies and moths. And the adult monarch butterflies, you're going to see them go on basically any plant that has nectar that they can reach. So you're going to see them on your coneflowers, your zinnias, which are non-native but annuals around here. But they need a very specific plant to be able to reproduce. So they're looking for milkweed, which is a genus of a bunch of different species of native plant that grow in a bunch of different conditions around our state and actually throughout the United States, because monarch butterflies are found basically throughout the United States. They kind of come out in the Rockies a little bit, but they have a western population as well. So there's a bunch of different species there. We have at least 3, maybe 4 native species of milkweed just here in Pennsylvania. But they are looking for that specific cue, and that's the only place they're going to lay their eggs. So they can get all the nectar they want from any type of plant, but they need that native plant genus to be able to reproduce. And then, of course, these guys, if you don't care about bugs, if you think there's an ick factor to bugs, but you do care about birds, that's another really important element. So songbirds, about, I think it's between 85 and 95% of songbirds rely on insects to feed their offspring in the spring. So if we need native plants to have the maximum number of insects and larvae, then we're going to be able to feed more birds. And that has been borne out in the research. They did a study on chickadees and showed in a yard where there was over 70% biomass, so that's the mass of all the plants in there, 70% biomass that was native plant species. On average, the nests had 1 more chick survive. So it is borne out in actual additional animals being added to our ecosystem. And they then cross-checked that to say okay, what about the native plants, really was it? And they looked and found that on oak trees, for example, they hosted 400 different species of larvae on them. So they were able to then confirm and correlate that yes, the native plants were also hosting more bugs. It's not just kind of a guess, it seems to be confirmed through the data. So if you care about songbirds, then that's something that you want to keep in mind, planting native plants. And then in the summer and the fall, they're also going to eat seeds off of native plants as well. They're going to take shelter in native plants. And then if you don't care about that, but you care about red-tailed hawks or peregrine falcons, then you want songbirds, because that's going to be part of their diet too. And all of this is all connected to each other, and all originates with the sun, but then native plants. So we've talked about the symbiotic relationship within the ecosystem. So next is that they're adapted to local conditions, which means that they can require less resources. So if you've ever had like a container of annuals that you've tried to keep going, or a hanging basket, maybe that's an easier thing to picture. If you don't give it food, it will eventually run out of resources and it will look terrible over time. You always have to be able to fertilize it. Native plants, they grew in these crappy clay soils that we have here. They're pretty used to living off the slim pickings that we have. And they're also adapted to our regular levels of rainfall, our summer conditions. You're gonna have to do less like extra mulching to make sure that their roots are insulated from the winter time, or make sure, you know, your tomato plants don't get too hot so they don't set flowers, so you're gonna need to put shade over them. All of those things aren't as necessary with native plants. That's on the condition that you put them in the right spot. So it's important to note that, like, here in Phoenixville, this is not the perfect representation of the climate that you're gonna find in the middle of the woods 200 plus years ago when William Penn was setting up camp, right? This is gonna be a lot warmer, not just because of climate change, but because of the sun hitting the pavement and the micro climate that we have here in a more urban area. A lot of times when they develop, they'll strip our topsoil out and they'll put in some fill dirt. So if you encounter a lot of rocks and things like that, that's pretty typical around here. And each of these native plants are native to a particular ecosystem. So some of them are going to be really adapted for a really dry spot, and you might have one of those in your yard. And some of them are going to be adapted to a swamp, and you might have part of that in your yard. That's what I have in the back of my yard, is a really wet spot. So you want to pick a plant that's really suited to thrive in the particular area that you have. Otherwise, you're going to say, why do I have to water that winterberry holly all the time? It's because you stuck it in a spot that's too dry and it wouldn't have survived naturally there. You want to put it in someplace wet. These also help stabilize erosion and runoff. So, I know there's a picture. So this is a graph here showing a little bit about the root structure of some of our native plants. So especially things like native grasses have really, really long root systems. That makes them very drought tolerant because they're able to access water a lot deeper than the general groundwater that a lot of the non-natives that happen to have. It's not like all plants not from southeastern Pennsylvania have little root systems, but there are a lot of popular ones that do. So prairie dropseed, that would be a native grass around here. You're going to get 8 feet of roots going down. It makes them a pain to transplant, so you want to pick their spot carefully, but it does mean over time that you're going to do a lot less care for them, and it means it's going to stabilize your soils. So as water runs through your soil, it will also come in contact with these roots. The roots help filter out pollution. They help filter out extra fertilizer that's run off. It's a really good way to help protect our waterways and protect your soils. So if you've ever mulched on your garden, which you should, it's very worthwhile because you reduce weeds and things like that. But it also helps protect your topsoil from erosion. Just planting things on there can do the same thing. It can also protect your soil from erosion as well. Do I know which way I'm going? Sense of place. So this is one that maybe we underestimate a little bit on what the value is. So I used to live in Indianapolis for 5 years, and there was a road in Indianapolis that you could drive down the middle of, and it was like 4-lane highway, pavement, and then you'd pass like an AutoZone and a McDonald's and Taco Bell. And I would drive down it thinking I could be literally any place in America right now. There is nothing that tells me I am in Indianapolis. There is no local small business that I can be like, yes, okay, I know where I am. And there was no plant life around either to say that I was here or in Florida or in California. And we live in a kind of special place. I really like southeastern Pennsylvania. I moved back here. I dragged my husband from Minnesota and made him put down roots here. And we have such wonderful wildlife and wonderful native plants. And if we plant a bunch of plants that are non-native, we start to change the character of the place we live in. It's harder to recognize exactly where you're at if you're not planting things that are from that area. And I think that it's, special to have something that's unique to you, And when you have those native plants, you're also going to come along those monarch butterflies and other native species that really make it recognizable as our area. So I think it's important to be proud. Like, if you're proud that you live in Phoenixville or the surrounding area, this is one way to kind of show that pride, to really represent. So there is some gray area. I talked about that like squishy definition in the beginning already. So we can start with where a plant is native to. So when we talk about native plants, this is the range map of red maples. So red maples are one of the most populous species of tree here on the East Coast. They are in a bunch of different forests. And so they are native all up and down this area. But if you drove down to a nursery in Florida and you got a red maple from here, it probably doesn't have the same exact genetics as a red maple from up here. Because Florida has very different conditions. They need to be able to survive different sorts of temperature ranges. So each area has a little bit more specific ecotype. So that's going to be not a different species, but maybe a different set of genetics that make it better adapted to different conditions. And so it's important when you get your plants from an area. I was thinking about this the other day because I listen to a lot of podcasts and I get online nursery ads sometimes. And those plants are not going to come from my localized area. So even if it's a native species, it wasn't necessarily grown with my conditions in mind. So we source the vast majority of our plants, and I think most of our native plants, from like right here. So right in that little tri-state area. And that means that those plants were grown in our conditions, but also a lot of them were selected specifically because they're going to be successful in our area. Also, we say like, oh, is it native to Pennsylvania? Well, state borders are a human construct. Like, what is Pennsylvania to nature, right? And really, like, our conditions here in eastern Pennsylvania are very different than Appalachia, are very different from western Pennsylvania. There are species that do not cross that mountain borderline. So saying something is native to Pennsylvania actually isn't as descriptive as you might think it is. And the National Forest Service kind of gives us a better definition. It came up on the other screen. There we go. Okay, cool. They recommend locating plants in the same level 3 ecoregion as you, which begs the question of what the heck is a level 3 ecoregion? And I wish I had a really good answer for you, but I did not feel like the National Forest Service gave me a really good answer to that. But for us, it is this area right here in what I like to describe as baby poop brown. And if you have a baby, you know what I mean. It's this light kind of yellowy color here. And what you'll notice is this is Pennsylvania. And ours just kind of touches this southeast corner, and it goes all the way down through Virginia. So this part of Maryland and Virginia has more similar rock structure, soil structure, temperature patterns to us than western Pennsylvania does. So you can find some things. Sometimes I will look at guides for native plants, and things that they recommend in Maryland and Virginia, I still consider very much within our fair game realm, because a lot of those are going to cross over within this area or naturally migrate over time in this area, especially as temperatures get warmer. A lot of the plants are adapting a little bit further north. So another gray area here is something called nativars. So humans have always selected plants for particular advantages. So you can think that's how we got a lot of our food crops, right? They didn't just have a tomato pop out of the earth. We selected them for particular varieties. And I'm also the veggie orderer at Colonial, and we have over 50 varieties of tomatoes that we sell, and there are like 15,000 that exist. So people are selecting them, okay, I want the most productive tomato, I want the most tomatoes possible. Or I've had a lot of problems with wilt or another disease in my garden, so I want the most disease resistant possible. Or I need to grow one for the grocery store, and they want them all to look the same size, and the same color, and the same consistency always. So I need one that's going to always produce the same fruit. Or I want the biggest tomato. Or I want one that's a weird color. It's easy to see that in our food crops. But we do the same thing to all plants. We love to experiment a little bit. So this is where we get into what we call cultivated varieties, which in our industry you shorten to cultivar, and then when we talk about native plants, people call them nativars. So it's a variation on a native plant. I'll say that there's kind of two ways that these come about, and people have really strong opinions about kind of the different levels you go on. So I guess I should start this area of I'm not judging where you fall on this scale of how much of a purist you want to be with your native plants. So if you're someone who wants to only have native plants that you've collected, hence collected the seeds from like a wild area in your, in your natural park, and you put it right there, or if you're someone who's like, I'm fine buying it from the nursery, or if you're someone who says, I'm fine if it's from Pennsylvania, not our eco-region, or if you say, I'm fine if it's a cultivated variety as long as it's native, really like we want to get away from grass. That's really like our hardest thing that we want to get away from. We want to get away from invasive species. We want to get towards native species. So you get to select your comfort level. I'm just here to provide the information. So for those cultivated varieties, there's kind of two different ways that they come about. One is you find them. So that could be going out into nature and finding a plant that looks a little weird. So you're driving down the road and you see a bunch of red buds, and then you see one that has a weird colored leaf. And so if you're a horticulturalist, you might go out and be like, I'm going to take a snippet of that, and I'm going to see if I can propagate that, and if that gene holds steady when I propagate it. And now, over time, you propagate, you have a different selection of that plant, and that's a cultivated variety. So, is that plant native? I mean, it came from a native plant, but it was a genetic mutation that doesn't necessarily represent that full spectrum of what you normally find out in nature. The other way you do it is you say, okay, there's some native plants like, for example, Monarda or bee balm. There's several species of native bee balm. So you might say, I like the trait of this one and I like the trait of that one. I can cross-pollinate them myself and produce a new plant that has some of my favorite desired traits. So sometimes people will do it just for color reasons. This is one of my most interesting examples to me, at least. Does anyone know what this is? I know, it's like a little evergreen. It is very nondescript. It's called an inkberry holly. Inkberry hollies are a native plant. They're good for pollinators. They're one of those native evergreens, which we don't have a whole lot of around here. And people like to propose them as an alternative for boxwoods, because boxwoods are a very common foundation plant that people have in their yard, but they're normally from either Europe or from Asia. But inkberries look like this normally, and if you've seen a boxwood's basically a cartoon plant. It's like just a perfectly round little bush when you prune it that's got leaves from the top to the bottom in like the exact same density. And these get what we call leggy, where they grow over time, they shade out the bottom, the plant says these leaves aren't doing anything for me, and so they drop them and they just have them up top. That's, I think, for someone who doesn't care as much about native plants, a deal breaker for some people if they want the cartoon bush. So there's a horticulturalist who's going out, and he was in the Pine Barrens in Jersey, and basically he would go around, and every time he did like a talk or a seminar in different areas, he would go out and look for inkberries. And he was in the Pine Barrens, and he found some that looked like little cartoon bushes. So he took some clippings, he propagated them, he was able to take the most successful ones, and he was able to breed a version of the inkberry that looks a lot more like the boxwood. So now, maybe for a different audience, this is now a more viable option than it was before. There's still less genetic diversity in these than you're going to have in your native inkberries, like your general wide selection, but it opens up to a new audience. So it's a little bit of like a give and take on this. So I'm always very reluctant to consider these as like obviously bad compared to the native species. We know that the native species is something that the birds and bees can recognize. So we want to make sure that we maintain as many of the traits that as they recognize as possible. But when you are able to do something like this, or for Monarda, for example, it gets powdery mildew. If you've got bee balm at home, you know what I'm talking about. So if you can breed in some disease resistance where it doesn't get as much mildew, and then the person who's really gardening mostly for aesthetics can see that as a bigger option, there's some advantages to breeding some of these more desirable traits. Another one would be stronger stems. So if you have a really floppy native plant, but you breed stronger stems into it, it's now a cultivated variety, but have you compromised its ability to feed wildlife? The biggest thing, so potential drawbacks, breeding out nectar or berries. So if you select for one trait, you don't always know what you're selecting against. You don't know what those genetics. So if you were to say, okay, well, I'm going to select for a different color coneflower, so there's a million different color coneflowers, you don't necessarily know if you're also telling that coneflower to make less nectar for the animals as well. So that's always a potential. The Mount Cuba Center, if you've ever been to Mount Cuba Center, Delaware, they've done some really good studies on some native plants where they compare the different cultivated varieties and straight species to see if it does impact pollinator visits. Color change impacting insects. One of the things we do know is if you change the color of the foliage, you will change the insect's ability to detect it as a food plant. So things like Calicanthus, which is sweet shrub, and ninebark have both been bred for more beautiful colors. That has made them more popular. But we also know that there are insects that use them as host plants don't recognize them as well. So if you're planting for wildlife, stick to either the cultivated variety or the straight species that's going to have the same color foliage especially. You want to make sure that you're not messing with the bloom time, because remember that Jacob's ladder that blooms the same time as its pollinator bee is active? If you change that, then you're going to impact its ability to be pollinated and have that advantage to the native wildlife. Another one would be ruby-throated hummingbirds, for example. They seem to have a migration that goes alongside red columbine around here. The males come up, they migrate from the south 2 weeks earlier than the females, and that is sometimes one of the only plants that's available to them. So making sure that you have this straight species can have that advantage there. And then you have to worry about things like genetic clones. Like we all got the strongbox inkberry, and then there was a disease that was like specific to the strongbox versus the regular, then you could lose a bunch of them. Because there are so many cultivated varieties out there, I think that danger is probably not as strong as is a potential, but it's always out there. It's always something that you should be thinking about. So, pros and cons. I have both in my yard if it makes you feel better. Nope, not gonna learn it. So if you want to know the difference between those, if you're looking for the straight species, this is Echinacea purpurea, which is the native coneflower. What you're going to see on it is just the scientific name. So we'll have genus, species, no other words on there other than the common name on there. So just coneflower, purple coneflower would also be fine. If you go here, you'll see Echinacea purpurea, hope. And hope is in single quotation marks. That is now a cultivated variety. Now, they can have cultivated varieties again. There's like one called the Magnus, which just seems to be a much bigger version of the natural occurring one. And someone's just patented it, said, hey, I found that, that's mine. I get money if people propagate it and sell it in their nurseries. So, again, these little quotations don't mean like anything in particular other than it's a cultivated variety. It's not a value judgment on those. But if you want a straight species, this is still just one species. If you take a look at the top of this one, you'll see that it just says Echinacea up there. Or sometimes you'll see it says Echinacea X. And that means it's a cross between multiple species of Echinacea. So now we're getting further away from that original form. This one has interesting different petal colors. And for coneflowers, the biggest thing you want to look out for is you don't want it to have the pom-pom in the center. So this is really naturally what coneflowers look like, is they have these seed heads on top. Leave them after they bloom. The finches will eat them. It's awesome if you like goldfinches. But if you have the ones that they'll breed ones that have like little petals in the middle, that's harder for the bees and butterflies to get nectar. So steer away from those if you care about pollination on those. All right. So native plants in your yard, the first thing I think that you should think about is what are your goals. If your goals are to maximize wildlife benefits, you might be looking at trying to stick to more of those straight species. If you want to reduce maintenance, you might be going for things that have some cultivated varieties because you might be able to get a smaller one with stronger stems, one with disease resistance. Again, that whole balance is up to you, but it's important, I think, to identify your goals for different spots in your yard. The next thing is to look at your space. So in your yard, you're going to have different light conditions and you're going to have different soil and drainage conditions. So when we talk about full sun, we're talking about 6 or more hours of sunlight a day. When we're talking about full shade, it's typically like 4 or less. We'll get in a little bit more on that. And you should think about how you use that space too. So I have a toddler and a dog, so I will have lawn. My husband hates mowing the lawn, so we're trying to get rid of our front lawn because we don't really use it very much. Now, part of my goals is to make sure my neighbors don't hate me, so I want to make sure I'm selecting species that are going to be the most beautiful for the longest time possible, so that they know that I'm not just, letting weeds grow everywhere, and I'm thinking about it. But the backyard, I'm going to keep that centralized area a place where my dog and my toddler can run out their energy and really look at the sides of where I can put in stuff. So think about how you use that space. And then other considerations, this is pokeweed right here. It's native, it's poisonous. So if you have a toddler who likes to pick the blueberries off your bush like mine does, I don't really want this native plant in my yard. So again, native for your particular space is not a value judgment for whether or not it's a good spot for it. Now there are different ways to approach native plants. This is a picture from Valley Forge. So this is their meadow out there. If you talk to them or read any of their signage, they intensively manage this meadow. So that's making sure that they keep out invasive species. But you'll also see sometimes they burn it or they mow it down because our natural ecosystem in meadows includes things like elk and bison that help keep trees at bay. So I do have people who come up to the store and say, I want to start a meadow, and I don't know that they really understand what that term really means. Typically, I think what they mean is I want to have a bunch of wildflowers that are going to help support the butterflies and bees around. But a true meadow is actually a lot of work to manage. And then you have a little bit more of a formalized garden over here, so you could look at the cottage style, or you can do more formalized landscape. But you can still work in, this is some type of rutabaga back here, or helianthus. There's some milkweed in there and some purple coneflower. You can take your existing garden structure and you can substitute in native plants. There are pros and cons for wildlife for each. Obviously this has a lot of cover. You're going to get more diversity of wildlife that can use that space underneath to really hide from people, so you might have more shy things. But in this setting, they did a study looking at milkweed and its ability to host caterpillars. And they found in the garden setting, because it didn't have as much competition, milkweed grows bigger. And bigger means more caterpillars. So it is not inherently always better to have this in your yard, especially if you grow to hate it or your neighbors hate it. You want something sustainable for you that's really going to work to meet your goals, and you can still do it in a way that wildlife are still going to be really able to appreciate it. I live in a neighborhood that's almost exclusively non-native plants when you look around, in lawns, but when we started planting our native plants, immediately we saw butterflies and bees. They will find you. It will happen. So let's talk about some of the different types of plants that are available to you and a little bit of what their benefits are to wildlife as well. So first you have canopy trees. So think about your maples, your oaks, your sweet gums, your tulip trees, hickories, beeches. So Pennsylvania means Penn's Woods. It was mostly forest before we got here. These have the biggest benefit to wildlife, and you can think about it, they're just the biggest things as well. So oaks have over 500 species that use them as a host plant. Maples have over 400. Birches are another one, they've got over 300. If you have space for a canopy tree in your yard, consider planting one, because it's going to have a huge impact. It provides home for wildlife, and not just the insects, but also the birds, the squirrels. They're resistant to low intensity fires, so we don't care as much about wildfires up here, but even New Jersey had wildfires earlier in the year. and they're changing some of the regulations to try and help with that. They can also shade your house, which can reduce your energy costs. So if you put a big canopy tree on the south side of your house, as the sun goes over in the morning, it'll warm up with the sun, but as it gets into the hot afternoon sun, it's blocked by that tree and makes your air conditioning work less hard. But in the winter, because it drops its leaves, it's not shading it out, so your heater won't have to work any harder. So that's a way you can use it to your advantage. Some things to note is we do have some native trees that are no longer available to us, mostly due to invasive species. So American chestnuts have been wiped out by the chestnut blight, elms have been wiped out by Dutch elm's disease, and ashes, most recently, you guys probably have experienced this, is losing an ash tree to the emerald ash borer. When it got cold enough to cross the Rockies within the last 10-20 years, it got here. These are just borers that go into your tree, and they end up killing the vascular system of the tree. And so in Phoenixville especially, we've lost a lot of our shade trees that were used to line our streets because of invasive species like the emerald ash borer.
It's so pretty.
I know, right? That's how I feel about lanternfly like larvae. Stinkers. Get out of here. Drawbacks is space and maintenance. So if you have an oak and it drops a bunch of acorns on you, you might not like that as much. Space, if you plant a maple or a birch, for example, they have such shallow roots, it's going to be really hard to grow things underneath them. So this is really for people who have the space. You don't want to put like a birch tree, for example, right next to your house because it actually can get to your pipes. So think about the placement really carefully, but if you have the space, very worth it for wildlife. Underneath those canopy trees in the forest grow the mid-understory trees. These are often flowering trees, so a lot of people put these in their front yards because you get a lot of like aesthetic value to them as well. I've got this one in my front yard. Anyone know what that is? Redbud, yeah. Anyone know what this is? Dogwood. What about this one? Serviceberry. Wow, yeah, you got the hard one too. That's awesome. Yeah, so these are mid-size, so they're going to be typically more like the 20 to 30 foot tree versus the 60 to 80 foot tree. If you're still like, that doesn't sound small at all to me, that sounds huge, again, cultivated varieties are going to give you more options where they will stay a little bit more dwarf. So redbuds, dogwoods, crab apples, plums, serviceberries are one of my favorite because their berries kind of taste like apples and blueberries mixed together, and the birds really like them too. So that's a really great one for the front of your yard. They stay pretty compact, and redbuds, for example, offer really early season nectar for bees and shelter for wildlife as well. These are actually host plants. All of them are host plants too. So. Oh, nope, dang it. I was so close. Deciduous shrubs. So the next layer down in the forest is going to be shrubs that drop their leaves. These benefit smaller species, or so the benefits of these are that they're smaller species, and they have both flowers and foliage that can be beneficial. So this is buttonbush right here, and it's been so long I don't even remember what this guy is. It might be, I think it might be a fothergilla, which is a bottle thrush. But we have witch hazels that are native, fothergilla, clethra, which is the summer sweet plant. It's got like really long panicles of flowers. Red twig dogwoods, they drop their leaves in the winter to have these really beautiful red twigs, which if you like decorating your own like Christmas pots and stuff, you can always harvest and then get decorations out of them. Viburnums, and then my favorite native plant is blueberries. Aren't we so lucky to live in a place where blueberries are native? Blueberries are host to over 300 species of larvae. They also feed like every animal under the sun, including us. And they're just fantastic plants. They like acidic soil and full sun. So if you do want to have blueberries, that's their best conditions. And it's good to have two, although again, cultivated varieties, there are some that are self-pollinating. So if you only have a container, there are ones you can grow in containers. Evergreens. Shelter for birds. We just found a robin's nest in one of our skip laurels out there. Not a native plant, but they still used it as shelter, and so that mama robin's going to be raising her eggs there. And they have year-round color for your yard. So my dad, when he does landscape designs, generally starts with the evergreens because you want to have some sort of foundation that's always going to make your yard attractive throughout the year. So he oftentimes will start with that as the basis, and then build on top of that with the deciduous shrubs and the perennials. We have inkberry hollies and winterberries that are both native here. Winterberries do actually drop their leaves late in the season. Again, another good Christmas decoration if you don't want to leave them for the birds. Hemlocks, white pines, and red junipers are all options around here. Shade perennials. So now we're getting into herbaceous perennials, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying there's no wood involved. And so over the winter time, normally they die back to the ground. There are some that stay evergreen, but oftentimes they'll reemerge then again in the spring. For shade perennials, they're going to thrive in 6 or less hours of sun, which is normally morning sun versus afternoon sun, good for the east or the north side of your house. We've got foam flower. This is the columbine we were talking about. Ferns, the Jacob's ladder we were talking about before. Woodland phlox is one of my favorites. I've seen some sphinx moths on there, which is very cool. Nope. There we go. But sun perennials are where it's at. There's so many varieties of sun perennials out there. One of my favorites is jokai weed right there. Anyone know what this is? Was it? Blazing star, yeah, Liatris. There's several native species of Liatris. They look like little Dr. Seuss plants. And by little, some of them are this big, some of them are this big. We've got Helianthus and Heliopsis, which are false sunflower and sunflowers. Asters are really wonderful plants, a really good bang for your buck as far as pollinators go. Monarda, which is bee balm, Amsonia, blue star, ironweed, goldenrod. You have probably 70% of our selection includes a lot of shade perennials because there's just so many that we have available to us. And this is often also where pollinators are most active because they are cold-blooded, so they need the sun to warm up, and so that's why you'll see them on your sun perennials a lot more than your shade ones. Grasses and sedges, again, they're going to stabilize the soil due to the deep taproot, but they are also host plants in a lot of ways. They provide food for birds and nesting sites for turtles. My husband's a turtle keeper. I have to say turtles in this presentation. Year-round interest, a lot of these are evergreen. Some lawn replacement options in there. They are not, again, Mount Cuba Center did some studies on which ones best tolerate mowing. So keeping it as like a low mow sort of option. The answer is not a lot of them like to be mowed all the time, but they can grow to be maybe 6 to 8 inches long, and you can start to replace some of your lawn with that if you're comfortable with a little bit more length. Little blue stem, carex, prairie dropseed, panicum, all really great ones. Best plants for birds, echinacea, which is one we've covered a lot, has great seeds for birds. Blueberries, serviceberries, we get raspberries here too, great. Viburnum, you don't want to eat the berries, you'll let them eat the berries. Same thing with the choke cherry by its name. And again, that's all part of this ecosystem. So you're not feeding the hawk with the berries, you're feeding its food. Spotlight on milkweed we talked about a little bit. If you want a pollinator garden that is certified for monarchs, you don't have a choice but to do milkweed. I'm going to warn you against common milkweed, which is a native species around here, but it is incredibly aggressive. So one of the things that like my little science brain sometimes like is like my little red light going is when someone describes a native plant as invasive. It's really invasive. It went over this bed. It's like that's not the same thing scientifically speaking, but really what they mean is it's super aggressive and it will colonize the area whether you like it or not. So I have seen people plant common milkweed and then come to hate milkweed. We have swamp milkweed and butterfly milkweed. So this is swamp, this is butterfly weed. Butterfly weed stays a lot smaller and it's better for dry areas. Swamp milkweed will take wet soil, but it'll adapt okay to dry soils as well. Some people lost it in the drought last year, for example, so it might need a little supplemental watering. This stays short, this gets tall, but they are clump forming, so they're less likely to like end up halfway across your garden where you didn't want them. Again, we're talking about sustainability for you guys, so you want to make sure it's something that you really feel like you can do in the long run. But it's important for these guys because they migrate from Canada all the way down to Mexico and then back again, so it's important for you to have a patch so that they can reproduce there, and they'll also drink the nectar too. Some other things that you can do to help with wildlife. So incorporating native plants is really important, but really if you're doing it for wildlife and you use pesticides on them, then you're just shooting yourself in the foot. You're not going to actually accomplish anything because pesticides do not discriminate between the bugs you like and the bugs you don't like. That's been a struggle for me this year because I have a bunch of aphids on my beautiful Heliopsis, and it is making them look so sad. But we, selectively sprayed at one point. The second the fireflies came out, the aphids can have them. I'd rather the aphids have my Heliopsis, and it probably won't kill them. It'll just make them look uglier. But I'd rather have my fireflies. Reducing your lawn. Reduce your fertilizer use. So native plants can help you do that already. But what you'll commonly see on the internet when you ask, oh, what should I use on my lilacs or hydrangeas, is they'll recommend 10-10-10, which is a synthetic fertilizer that has been used by farmers and our grandparents for a very, very long time. And it's overkill for most things. When we have extra synthetic fertilizer, it will end up in the soils going into our waterways, and actually all washes out in the Chesapeake Bay and will cause algal blooms. And you probably didn't think that your garden has to do with dolphins, but the water connects us all, and that can actually impact dolphins and the food web in the ocean as well. So instead, we'd recommend, if you're going to fertilize something that needs it, you should try a slow-release organic fertilizer that's going to break down naturally over time, but typically has lower numbers, so that the plant will then be able to uptake it rather than it just leaching out into the soil. You also want to reduce your lawn. So lawns not only are just like biological wastelands, but also you have to, we just got like an electric mower, but generally you're also burning fossil fuels to keep them short. I think it's really, my mom grew up in a house where my grandfather would like cross mow, like the most beautiful, picturesque golf course lawn that you could think of. And so her instinct is very like, she shudders a little bit when people replace their front yards with native plants. I think it's partially because, again, they're leaning a little bit more into that meadow aesthetic, which is the exact opposite of what her aesthetic is. But the PR person in me gets it. Like, you've been trained your whole life to value one thing, and someone's asking you to go the complete opposite end. Again, there's a space in the middle where we can meet, where we can get some of that lawn away, and we can add some native plants and make them look beautiful and everybody be a little bit happy. But reducing your lawn is a huge way to also enjoy more of your time in your day and not have to mow it. Being water conscious, you can get a rain barrel. You can think about areas in your yard that stay wet and put the wet plants there, and ones that are more drought resistant in areas that stay dry. Keeping your cat indoors. Cats are the #1 cause of bird death in the United States, at least direct bird death. Land use change and habitat loss is actually the #1 cause of bird death and population decline. But cats kill billions of songbirds as well as other animals every year, including your pet cat. They've put GoPros on pet cats that were fed inside, that just had time outside, and they just have predatory instincts. So if you have a cat and you can keep them inside, get them some toys, play with them like they're a dog, and get some of those predator instincts out. But if you can keep them out of the ecosystem, you're going to have more hummingbirds, you're going to have more songbirds. It's going to keep a much healthier ecosystem. And then turning off your lights at night. So it's firefly season, and fireflies can get distracted not just by like street lights where you'll see like moths flying around in circles, but even the lights in your home. Also during migratory bird season in the spring and the fall, they can mistake lights for moonlight on the water and think that's a good place to land. It burns their extra energy, and sometimes we have collisions with glass, which is the #2 cause of death for birds. So turning off your lights, keeping your cats indoors, big, huge help to birds. And if you want to learn more about native plants, because I've just hit my hour, the Mount Cuba Center is in Delaware. They focus on native plants, and they do trial gardens every 2 years where they look at different cultivated varieties of plants compared to their straight species, and they rate them based on aesthetics and pollinators and all of the survivability, all good things. Audubon Society, you can type in our zip code, and it will go through a list of native plants that support your birds, including by bird species. So if you're like, I really want to see a northern flicker in my yard, it'll tell you what plants to plant. Valley Forge National Park, you can see how they manage their meadow. National Wildlife Federation is, they have a lot of native plant stuff for our area, so again, another place that you can type in your zip code. They'll also give you other factors that can make a certified wildlife habitat in your backyard. And then the work of Doug Tallamy, who's really kind of been revolutionary in this field. He is a professor from the University of Delaware, so a lot of his research is extremely applicable to our area because he does it at like Longwood or in our space, so it's not just like trying to extrapolate data from California to see if that applies over here. It's like real science in our backyard. And he has a lot of really great books if you want to learn more and really dive deep into native plants and gardening. He's got a new book coming out this year too. So, and of course, stop by Colonial Gardens because we've got lots of native plants, and I'd be really excited to help you pick the right ones for you. Yay! Okay, we hit an hour. So thanks guys for coming. Any questions I can answer?
Oh yeah, I have one right
Yeah,
away.
go
I
for
was always taught that the big advantage of a native plant is that you mess up and it's supposed to be in the shade and you put it in the sun, it'll adapt anyway. Now you said you gotta be careful of where you're gonna put it, so I
Yes.
was not taught right, is that right?
Yeah, I would say that that's, if you want it to thrive and you don't want to have to baby it, you want to put it in its best conditions.
Okay.
So there are certainly some plants like lobelia and turtlehead that will do fine in any of that spectrum of conditions, but then there are other ones like Heliopsis, which won't flower as much if you put it in the shade. So it might do okay, but it's not doing the thing you want it to do.
So you still need to look and see.
I would still look, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there are some species that'll do fine across the spectrum. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else?
Casey, I had a question on Zoom.
Sure.
Yeah, you know the 3 slides you had of the echinacea where you could tell what is a native and a cultivar or nativar?
Yeah.
Could you either explain or go back to that? Because like that will help us really know what's native, right? When we go to like a garden center.
It'll help you at least determine what's native versus non-native. Now you're going to have to look at scientific names, which is already maybe beyond what some people want to do. The problem with common names is that common names can be the same across multiple species, and there can be many common names. So like bee balm, wild bergamot, Oswego tea are all the same plant, but it also refers to a whole genus of ones. So if you said you wanted Echinacea tennesseeensis, that's a different type of echinacea versus purpurea, and you would need to look at which one you're actually looking for. But once you know what you're looking for, that's when you're going to take a look at the tag itself. If you want a straight species, not a cultivated variety, you want it just to have the genus and the species name. If you want something that just has a parent and is just selected for a certain trait, it's not cross of 2 different species, you want the genus, the species, and then just the one name in the quotation marks. So that's how you know that it's still a purple coneflower from that same species, but it is selected for particular traits. And then if you, oh man, I thought I'd get good at this, guys, I'm sorry. If you look at one and you just see either the genus or the genus with an X next to it, it means that its parents were from 2 different species within the same genus. And actually there are plants that are 2 different species in different genuses that you can pop together. So like Echinacea is a mix between Rudbeckia and Echinacea that they've been able to breed. So that's what you're looking for, and if you ever come to Colonial and you see me, I can walk you through it in our bed so you can see what's going on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So just a question about, my daughter has prickly pear, the native, but she lives in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
So I planted it in my gravel garden.
Sure.
Is that like a thing that's gonna work? Because it's in a different region?
Yeah, it's probably going to be okay. Pittsburgh is not terribly different from Pennsylvania. Prickly pear is a native cactus, very cool around here. And so it should probably be fine. Naturally, like the way populations move, you often won't see ones that cross the mountain line, but prickly pear does because it's native out here all the way out to at least Indiana. And we have pretty similar winters, so it should be fine. Yeah, it's when you start to get things from like South Carolina that you transplant up here that you're gonna get a little iffy. Anybody else?
Is there a specific blueberry that you would recommend?
No, I wouldn't, because it really depends on what your space is, because there's some that get 8 feet tall, and there's some that get 2 feet tall. So if you want to if you're just like, I want to maximize benefit for wildlife, and I don't care how big it gets, you're gonna go with the big guy. But if you want one that you could put in a container, or you want to be manageable, I've got them along the side of my house. I want them to max out about 3 to 4 feet, kind of like a normal ornamental shrub would, without coming out in my beds. I'm gonna go with a medium-sized one. But also, it depends on what you want to taste too, if you're growing them for yourself.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I just thought I'd ask, because I have hosta, you know, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether the groundhog's eating the leaves or is it the deer.
Yeah. The deer, so we have 12 deer that live right next to Colonial Gardens, and so I feel close to an expert about what's deer resistant, because in the winter they walk into the nursery and they eat. They have a smorgasbord, like imagine 1,000 different types of, it's shady maple for deer. And they're brave. They walk all the way up to our pond to drink the water there. They've gone into the garden houses if we leave the doors open, so they're not afraid of anything. So yeah, hostas are like that's salad, that's ice cream for them. They're all about it. There are definitely some deer resistant shade plants. You can look at things like hellebores are a really good one. They're not native, but they are a really good one, especially if you like blooming. Same thing with a stilby, that's another really good deer resistant one. As far as our natives go, they tend to be, what I'll say is they'll take damage and then they'll come back. So like early in the season, you've got foam flower or euchera, which are native around here, that's coral bells. Native around here, early spring bloomers. A lot of things in the shade garden bloom early. But that also means they come up as the deer are at their most ravenous because they haven't been able to find things. So they'll go through and they clip back our foam flower and we don't even let our hostas out that early because they just would destroy them. We had New Jersey tea, which is a very cool type of shrub we were really excited to get in, and the deer ate the whole thing out of the pot. So that's not deer resistant. So the foam flower and the euchera have popped back from that. So it is worth saying, like, it's not deer proof, but is it gonna pop back within the season to still be attractive when the deer are less hungry and less willing to come? So, I mean, we have hostas out in our woods and they eat them and then they come back the next year. So, yeah. There's some options though, and we have a list of deer resistant plants also. When you come to the store, we can match it with the right one. Groundhogs are tough though. They're little monsters. Any other questions?
Anyone else on Zoom? Last chance.
Well, if you guys think of anything, you can always come to the store. I'm typically there. Or you can always give us a call and see if we can match you up with a good answer, because I'm not an expert on all things, especially once we start getting into the trees category. But please come out, come visit. We'd love to have you. You all who came in person have a $10 off a native plant coupon, so come use it. Come start your pollinator gardens. And all our patchwork together, we're going to be able to save lots of wildlife. So thanks for coming, guys.
Thanks so much, Casey. Thank you.
I want to give these guys applause. You